Welcome back to Open Source Workplace interview series. Very glad to have you with us here once again. For those who don't know and haven't sort of come across Open Source Workplace before, Open Source Workplace is a community for business owners, workplace professionals seeking to share information, knowledge, insights for the collective purpose of maximizing workplace productivity and employee experience for everyone, no matter where they work, no matter what they do. And part of that is to bring you experts in the field. Today we have Ryan Anderson. Ryan is a good friend, someone who I turn to. I sort of lean on a lot for his knowledge and insights, given his experience. So Ryan, look, thank you today for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So if you were to sort of give a quick synopsis of your history, your work experience today, what would you say is your experience and your knowledge base?
Yeah, well, I've been fortunate. It's been about 25 years focused on workplace with a pretty strong emphasis on future workplace. Probably for the last 12 or 13 years, most of my focus has been technological, looking at how technology changes the way people work, how technology is impacting the actual built environment, and thinking a little bit about what it means to try to create places of work that are relevant and interesting and positive in the future. So very in line with what you're trying to do with open source workplace, I think.
No, I totally agree. And that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to actually have you on and sort of introduce you to those who don't know you. I know a lot of people in the industry do know who you are, and I'm sure they're eagerly anticipating the questions and hearing your various responses. So there we go. So one of the things as I was doing my research, obviously I know who you are, but you start sort of digging into people a little bit more when you're going to interview them. And I came across your LinkedIn page. I'm sure I've looked at it many, many times, but I actually never really took in that you actually on your banner you have do something great, which is a great thing. But for you personally, I mean, what prompted you want to sort of catch those words and put it on your LinkedIn page?
Yeah, it's on my desktop background too. It's a reminder basically of a couple different things. The first is that we only have a limited amount of time to make an impact. I know time is linear, but it doesn't feel that way these days. It seems like every couple of years, I'm like, wow, things are going fast. And I kind of came to the conclusion a few years ago that to do any sort of project work-wise that was significant took a good 3, 4, sometimes 5 years. So how many of those do we have? We need to steward our time wisely in terms of what we're trying to do. The other reminder is probably that we can work in jobs that might seem banal or boring, unrelated to making the world a better place, but actually I think we all have the opportunity to make a significant impact. It begins with how you treat the people around you. But for those of us in workplace, it's a matter of zooming out and realizing that the places that we help to create are kind of the infrastructure for where hundreds or thousands or millions of people spend a huge chunk of their lives. And if we get it right, we do a good service to a lot of people. If we get it wrong, maybe not so much. So yeah, it's just a reminder, really.
No, and I love the fact you said, to do something great takes 4 or 5 years. As I embark in this open source workplace, I sort of feel and I know that too, and you talk about being able to influence and impact so many people. Again, with open source workplace, that's what I'm looking to do, impact so many people. Given your background, your history, the companies you work for, you impact and your companies have impacted so many people every single day in the workplace. Well, the products they produce, the services they provide, the companies really do impact people. And sort of touching on that. So obviously your background, you've worked at Steelcase, Herman Miller. We'll talk about your other companies in a wee moment. But in essence, so how did you get into furniture, into workplace? Obviously, I'm sure where you sort of impacted that a little bit, but I'm really curious to understand what brought you into the industry.
Yeah. I live in Grand Rapids, which has been kind of Furniture City, USA for a long time. I had no connections to the industry whatsoever. When I went away to college, I told my roommate, who was also from Grand Rapids, if there's one thing I'm not going to get involved with, it's office furniture. Could anything be more boring? And a year later, I needed a summer job and managed to score an internship at Steelcase. And my eyes were opened. organizations, Herman Miller, Steelcase, Hayworth, and others invest a ton in research. There's been an interest in helping people to work better within this industry really since its inception. And so it was just far more interesting than I'd ever dreamt. And I was very fortunate in that most of my roles have been kind of on the edge of furniture, looking at how the industry could pursue new things as the world changes. And so it's kept it very interesting for me. As you know, I did leave for a while, but I managed to come back. So I'm part of the boomerang club, as we call it. But the industry's interesting because work keeps changing and workplace is very, very different than it was 25 years ago. So I think it's kept me interested and hopefully I've made a good contribution.
So, I mean, on that, I mean, obviously, 25 years, you think about the evolution of that industry. You know, we see the picture of the old cubicles and what the open plans are today, you know. We go forward to the campuses that Apple and Google and all are sort of creating. How do you think furniture has evolved through that process? I mean, and how has the approach changed over your tenure?
Yeah. Well, the industry's gone through a pretty radical change in the last 15 years, but the irony of it is in some ways it's returned to the pre-1970s kind of era, right? So if you look at workplace before the era of desktop computers, it was a little bit more diverse in terms of the variety of types of spaces that you might find. People weren't tethered to a given technology. Technologies of the day were typewriters and notepads and things of that nature. And for Herman Miller specifically, we had a diverse kind of array of offerings in residential, higher education, corporate office, et cetera. When desktop computers came around and Herman Miller had created systems furniture back initially in 1964, those two things kind of came together to create the very dense, often cubicle heavy, at least in North America, workplaces that we saw in the 80s and 90s. It was kind of a mixed bag. I mean, in some ways it was amazing for the industry. If a company went and hired 300 or 400 people, they'd buy 300 or 400 desktop computers and 300 or 400 desktop phones and 300 or 400 desks and desk chairs. And the industry grew like mad during the 80s and 90s. When mobility came around and people didn't have to do all of their work in one place. Now, sometimes culturally organizations still kind of require this, but typically people are only spending a fraction of their time, say at an individual workstation. Now we're back to thinking about what the variety of work could be. Those of you that might be familiar with the term Bürolandschaft, it was kind of where the roots of offices came out of Germany in the 40s and 50s that was focused on variety. It was really the roots of what today we're calling activity-based working. But at least in many parts of the world, that strategy got hijacked by the fact that you had to sit in front of a fixed piece of technology all day long. So the kinds of questions that we're revisiting now that that is different is what does the right variety of workspace look like? What does it mean to really understand these new patterns of behavior? And from a furniture industry standpoint, how do we make money in different ways, right? I mean, the industry as a whole is not making tons of money off big workstations anymore. So we've had to rethink what it looks like to serve organizations so that we can be profitable, but so that we can help in an authentic way.
And how do you go about doing that, evaluating and researching? What is that process? How does that work?
Yeah, there's a variety of ways that we do it at Herman Miller. Sometimes we'll go very big picture, looking at macro trends. We do that in a variety of ways. My favorite way is something called scenario planning, where basically you get a bunch of people talking about big changes in the world and you craft stories. The stories aren't actually predictions. In fact, in some ways they're the opposite. They're provocations around these are the various ways that the world could change. And you use those stories to debate what you might do if that's true. So if I said to the average person walking down the street, I want you to envision the future 25 years from now, they would probably struggle with it. But if I had them watch a couple movies, Blade Runner or Gattaca, I could then ask them specific questions around why is one so different than the other? So we like that approach. I just had the privilege of being involved in a scenario planning process at Autodesk. That's the other way we do it, by the way, is we have a really rich network of research collaborators that we participate with. But probably the way we do it most is through ethnographic research, which is it's going right into workplaces, watching people work, interviewing them, doing it with some trained people that can be objective in this, and looking for patterns. So if you're familiar with the kind of classic user-centered design book, A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, that's what we're looking for, is this new pattern language, ways that people are trying to behave and the space is in some ways limiting it. And our job then as design professionals is to rethink the objects in that space to allow them to do what they were trying to do in the first place, with as little friction as possible.
Yeah, no, it's a very involved process, I'm sure. So how do you evaluate different industries, different markets and geographies into that analysis? Does it vary? Does history show you that actually, a desk is a desk, and whether you're doing activity-based working or you're doing somebody who's going to be an assigned desk at the desk for heads down work 80% of the time, a desk is still a desk. And how do you approach that?
Yeah, great question. We're fortunate in the sense that I don't think Herman Miller ever defined itself as an office furniture company. We've always had products that span a lot of different areas. So our goal, by the way, if you look at our mission, is to create inspiring design that help people do great things. So maybe my personal reminder was a bit inspired, but basically wherever somebody's going to try to do some sort of work, we want to be there. And it probably 15, 20 years ago, if we talked about hospitality design or higher education design, that would have implied something really specific. But those worlds are kind of coming together in new ways. They're not necessarily homogenizing, but they're learning from each other. And so we've had the good fortune of having been in them for a really long time. I think we've done a better job of understanding global trends. We've had to be really intentional about it, getting people to places like Australia, different parts of Western Europe that feel like they're leading the way. But in general, yeah, it's just a matter of making sure you don't get too insular, too focused on what you know, and having a certain level of tolerance of ambiguity, and asking the question, what should we do different? I will say that we came up with a framework around 2012, 2013, as activity-based working was getting to be a more popular conversation in North America, for 10 different work activities. That has held up very well. And the question is usually, for a given organization, what's the mix of activities that they might want to focus on, and how effectively is the current or future environment supporting it? So there are some frameworks that are more human-centered activity-based that translate pretty well.
Yeah, no, I think I've seen that. I think you probably shared that with me, so I'll probably try and put a link below so people can find that study. It is really interesting. So obviously, your influence or your interest is in the future of work, and sort of obviously the furniture technology and sort of how they're sort of becoming connected and becoming even more connected. How did you get interested in that, and how's that evolved over your time in the industry?
Yeah, I've always been somebody who's been really interested in audience-specific things. I have a marketing background, so my first interest in it was really around understanding IT professionals. And in some ways, I still think that's probably where a lot of organizations need to center the conversation around how different audiences or different groups within an organization need to work together. But what really fueled everything for me was the rise of mobile technologies, which it was evident that nobody had to work in these furniture settings we were providing, and a trend that is lesser known perhaps within the real estate world, which is consumerization. So consumerization to an IT professional, and most know that term well, means the effect of consumer technologies on how we work and on the enterprise. It basically has resulted in people using a whole host of technologies they never had access to, having a desire for very intuitive, very positive, very simple in some ways technology experiences. And so just seeing some of these trends on the horizon, it was evident that workplace was going to have to shift. And because I found it personally interesting, although I don't consider myself very technical, I find the trends so interesting that I just kind of made a decision a while back to double down on learning this stuff. And I did. I have had to ask some of the dumbest questions to technology leaders that you could imagine. But I think it's totally worth it, not just for me, but for most of us, to ask some of those questions, because the returns are so long. I mean, if you learn a little bit about what's happening technologically, it will benefit you for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I guess the answer is it's a combination of my own boredom with the status quo curiosity about the future, and a realization that this stuff was going to impact our industry.
Yeah, no, and it's apparent how you're able to connect the dots between real estate and technology. You emceed the WX Summit in January of this year, and you were able to connect those different things and sort of help real estate folks understand what technology means, because often we have the same words, but they mean very different things between the different sectors. So what do you think are the more critical elements that real estate needs to know about a technology workplace and technology departments need to understand about a real estate workplace? What are the key factors you think both need to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind right off the bat. One is both of them have a tremendous impact on the way people work, but may not fully realize it. They may not fully realize it, let alone do they realize how each other's impacting things. The second is they are both heavily driven by past investments, so a bit standards driven, which is not all bad, and living in worlds where the standards are drastically shifting. So I'm not just talking about furniture standards here. I'm talking about just kind of when you're trying to deploy and scale different tool sets in the technology world or spaces in the real estate world, you have to land on a certain degree of efficiency, which drives you forward, which can create some frictions in terms of being adaptable. And so what's happened, and this is a kind of a simplification of it, but what's happened in the last 15 years or so is that the IT people, without totally realizing it, have given employees the tools to not have to use the real estate portfolio in the way that it once was or at all. And likewise, the real estate teams are creating spaces that are very impactful to how work is changing, as well as to workforce planning that may or may not be hospitable environments to use the technology tools that people are using. And so for me, it's a matter of making introductions between those groups, ideally not when somebody's kicking off a new headquarters project, because then there's a budget, there's a schedule, and there's pressure. But trying to, from a leadership standpoint, get those groups talking early on just around, so what's going on in your world? What's going on in our world? Can we talk a little bit about this? How are we impacting each other? Ideally, being in a place where they can learn together a little bit about some key trends in the workplace. We've seen that with many organizations. It tends to result in very, very positive outcomes because they can just inform their own strategies with what they learn from each other.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's my everyday experience trying to bridge those two together, real estate, technology, but then to your point, workforce planning, trying to bring those three silos together. That's where organizations will be successful. And it's a really tough thing to sort of calibrate and ensure happens. But yeah, it's a big conundrum, but I mean, one of the things I've always appreciated with you has been able to explain those different elements and see it from the different industry perspective and sort of put clarity to it. So sort of circling back a little bit. So you're with Herman Miller. You then decided to go and work for a startup. What prompted the decision for you personally? And then also what sort of surprised you about moving from such a, organization as Herman Miller and Steelcase before that to working for a startup? What surprised you about those things?
Yeah. So I'd been in the industry, 23 years or so, decided to go to a startup, a software as a service startup in Salt Lake City called Teem, Teem, not to be confused with Microsoft Teams. I guess there's a couple things. I was seeing, just because of my involvement in the technology world, how drastically changing the software as a service, the SaaS industry was moving, the effect that it was having on the technology world. It's just a really interesting business model, subscription-based. It creates this new kind of level of interaction between customers and product teams that is rare to see in other places. And to be honest, I'd worked in technology within the furniture industry for over a decade at that point, and a mutual friend of ours, Karen Gill at Fidelity, had once asked me, do you think that to kind of fully realize your ambitions, you'll need to go to a tech company? And it got me thinking a little bit. So being able to go to a software company in particular, because in general, the software world has overtaken the hardware world. You know, like what ended the BlackBerry? It wasn't a new keyboard, it was apps. And so in general, software is so drastically changing the way we work that I just wanted to be a part of it. And I loved it. It was some of the best work experiences I've ever had. I worked remotely here in Grand Rapids, spending 4 or 5 hours a day on video, believe it or not. I went out to Salt Lake City regularly. Eventually, we sold the business to WeWork last September. In terms of surprises, there were a few things. One was that I almost had forgotten how good some of these larger, more established organizations in the industry like Herman Miller or Steelcase are in terms of what we do. And so it was a pleasant surprise to be able to bring some learnings into a startup that maybe they hadn't thought about. So I felt really kind of emboldened and positive about that. The other thing is that, in a startup world, particularly in a venture-backed startup world, the goal is for people to build something big enough to exit it, right? To sell it like we did, to go public. And there's a certain spirit around building things, which is intoxicating, actually. I really, really loved it. Whereas with larger established organizations, more of the emphasis tends to be placed on running things at scale. And so, I think for me, one of my beliefs was that I realized just how much I enjoyed building something, and that if I was going to take a job with a big company again, which I did, that it would be centered around building things that organizations want. Because for me, that was where the fun was, and it was a great experience, both at Teem and at WeWork.
Yeah, so Herman Miller, they pulled you back in, So what sort of, from those experiences and learnings, have you brought to Herman Miller in sort of your mentality, your approach to design, creating, and sort of building upon that legacy that is Herman Miller?
Yeah, well, there's a few things, and Herman Miller is just thriving right now. It's doing well on a whole host of levels, I think culturally, financially, et cetera. We have a new CEO as well as several new members of the leadership team, new chief digital officer, new chief strategy officer. My boss is now, he made a different move. He's now chief technology officer. So what I found when I kind of re-engaged the conversations was an organization that was very interested in digital transformation broadly. Digital transformation, by the way, is usually, the way I understand it best is it's ways of taking technology to move complexity off of customers, sometimes in the company, ideally out the back door, so that complexity is reduced. And we are in an industry that is so unbelievably complicated. It's a B2B organization, complex buying processes, complex pricing practices, complex distribution network that, they were really interested in just talking about how technology might be able to make life better for the people we serve. And we're very interested in exploring new ideas with kind of a startup mentality. So timing was great. It's been a lot of fun so far. And I'm part of a broader team where some people are focused on internal processes, some are focused on channel. I'm focused on our customers with a particular eye on what's changing in the real estate world. So it's kind of the marriage of a lot of my interests.
So how do you think digital transformation is really going to intersect with furniture in the future?
Yeah, it already has. I mean, we can think a little bit about how physical technology like hardware and furniture relate, which is historically how we would have thought about workstations or audiovisual. It's, as I mentioned, because software is making more of an impact than hardware, we have to take a little bit of a look deeper and look at how the software and the technologies that people use is changing those work patterns. And so there's just a variety of ways that if you look at the ways people are starting to work now, that the technology has changed even in recent years. By the way, my dog is weighing in. If you're hearing background, one of the perils of working from home, I like to ask organizations who want to support remote work how they feel about furry employees joining in the conversation. So here's an example. In fact, I just wrote a piece for this for Cornet. Collaboration has changed because of software. When we talk about collaboration in kind of the interior design or workplace strategy world, I think we're still often focused on what happens when people get together in the same place at the same time, like in a room. But if you look at Slack or Microsoft Teams or the Google Suite or OS 365, a lot of people are collaborating in an asynchronous way. Like I'll jump into a document for a little while, then you'll come back, and do some of it. And we wouldn't think that collaboration would require privacy or the need to use your laptop for an hour and a half on your own. But in fact, in some cases, that's exactly what it needs. So the average phone booth isn't great for this. There's actually a need to provide a little bit more cognitive or physical comfort for those sort of scenarios. So that's one example. The key, though, is understanding the changes in the work patterns. If you can look at the technology and say, all right, can we just try to imagine how somebody using this technology will work differently in a few years? Then we can figure out the space and the furniture side. The physical hardware integration, like where to mount a camera, where to put a monitor, I think we've kind of worked through that stuff pretty well. And we'll continue to try to do that well, but that's not where the complexity is right now.
No, really interesting. So whenever you think about technology and future technologies, what sort of excites you, or do you think will have a greater impact on workplace of the future?
Yeah, there's so many. I think the one that we're immediately poised to see, well, when I say immediately, I'm talking the next 5 to 10 years, is augmented reality. AR is kind of a sister or brother to virtual reality. Virtual reality and augmented reality are quite old. By the way, I'm going to take a brief aside and tell you that one of my personal missions is to help facilities and real estate people not tell me that technology changes so fast that they can't understand it, because that's just not usually the truth. What usually happens is technology matures over decades, and it kind of pops up when people aren't expecting it. So virtual reality is, I think, 29 years old. Augmented reality isn't far behind, but how they're commercialized and used in our industry has changed a great deal. So we started using virtual reality with customers years ago, but VR requires a headset typically, and it's an unusual experience if you've never done it. You know, you've got this thing strapped to your face and you're gesticulating wildly around. You can't often see what you're seeing. And so there's some weird social norms in terms of trying to just use that technology on a day-to-day basis. Augmented reality is a little bit different. It can be used without a headset. It can just be used on devices to kind of project digital things into the physical environment. It's already gotten good traction in consumer kind of retail sort of situations. Pokemon Go, the Harry Potter equivalent of it, I can't remember the name of it, has gotten people a little bit more used to seeing digital things in the real environment. And now I think very soon we'll begin to see Google Maps giving us augmented wayfinding through cities. So it's nice. It's a way of actually focusing on the real physical environment, but offering a little bit of digital content to help out. And I think there's a variety of ways that we'll see it impact the creation of space, the management of space, and the use of it on a day-to-day basis. So that's one. There's probably 10 others I could go to, but in the interest of time, that's probably one to keep an eye on.
No, and it's sort of, I'm glad you raised that up. I've literally just released an article on Open Source Workplace, 10 ways virtual reality is going to improve workplace productivity. So that'd be a nice article to link to, and that people can go and read, and be interested to see how we tie back to your guidance and your foresight. So look, thank you, and I appreciate everything that you've shared with us and sort of making yourself available. I have 2 questions that I sort of like to finish with everybody. Obviously, the mission of Open Source Workplace is to maximize workplace productivity and employee experience. And sort of, if you had to give one little tidbit or advice or guidance, whenever, from your experience, when people think about maximizing workplace productivity, what sort of guidance would you give to folks?
Yeah, there's a few things. And by the way, I couldn't be a more passionate supporter of what you're doing, because there's so much ambiguity and so much changing that having a peer-to-peer network to try to understand and work through this stuff is ideal. One thing I already mentioned, which is getting disciplines within an organization who impact how people work together to talk about how are we impacting work, which might seem like an awkward conversation, but it's a good place to start. And I think having IT and real estate professionals talking to each other about the sort of things that they're investigating, the sort of things they're trying. IT people will call it dog fooding, eat your own dog food. Basically, there's some room somewhere in the organization where people are trying out new things. What are you trying? How do you imagine deploying that or sharing that with our employees in the future? Is a great place to start. The second thing is, and I kind of alluded to it a few moments ago, it would behoove, I think, any professional within the facilities and real estate world to begin to learn a little bit more about some of the major technology trends that are happening. There's a saying in Silicon Valley that an overnight success takes 20 years. That's true. In fact, most of the startups that are going public now, whether it's Zoom, we're using Zoom now, or Lyft or Uber, these are 10, 12-year-old companies, and the technologies behind them are even more mature. If you begin to learn about things like VR and AR, as an example, it won't just benefit you for the next year or two. Honestly, particularly when you start talking about how technologies are deployed or incorporated within our industry, it takes a long time. And so by getting up to speed now, you're benefiting the next 10, 20 years for sure. And you can also begin to have different conversations within your team. So I think for me, that's probably the two of the most practical ways to start, is having those conversations with internal counterparts and going out and learning a little bit. For those that aren't familiar with it, there is an emergent technology category known as CRE tech, or corporate real estate tech. And I think there's awesome resources now to begin to introduce people to technologies that do something very similar to what you just talked about, Steve. Improve employee experience, but also help with more kind of operational efficiency outcomes. And we know that every real estate professional has to do both.
Yeah, and to that point, the one conference I think that is speaks to that very, very highly is CoreTech. It's a great conference. The guys there have done a great job bringing technology and real estate together, and it's a phenomenal conference. So then the other side of it, employee experience. What sort of what guidance would you give to people if they wanted to maximize employee experience?
Well, it's clearly the higher bar in some ways, and it's a bigger challenge. I don't know how to do it without understanding two things. One, the emerging work patterns, which is just a fancy way of saying what are people physically trying to do within the work environment, and changing expectations. And when I talked about consumerization earlier, that was as much about expectations as it was anything else. The reality is any space that's built today is in competition with a million other places where somebody could go to do their work. Certainly home, coffee shop, co-working, but also it goes beyond that. And so I think it's an imperative, actually, that people try to understand on some level what the employees of their organization expect and hope for out of a work environment. I know that can be tricky. People will have their wish list and they'll ask for things that you could never deliver on. But what we're looking for here is patterns. What are the patterns that are emergent? And between those things, I think you can begin to try to accommodate people's work patterns and their expectations in new ways by prototyping new initiatives, getting to know employees and getting their feedback in new ways. But it's a long journey. I don't think it happens for most overnight.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It is. But look, thank you, Ryan. I really, really do appreciate you making the time, taking the time and sharing your insights. And obviously, thank you again for everything you do for the industry, and thank you everything you do for me and your continued support. So if you like this, please do feel free to like, share, and sign up for Open Source Workplace. We're a community that is there for end users, workplace professionals, so those that work within organizations, and also for service providers, so those that provide services to the workplace. So please do sign up, do support the network, and we will endeavor to continue to sort of pursuing and provide content, be it text, video, and audio. So thanks again, and please do like, share, and we'll speak to you next time. Thank you. Take care.